We frantically called the local 911, which had to get to the 911 in our neighborhood. Most of our neighbors were gone for the holiday weekend. Nobody was around to help. There was just a big old fire. This is gonna be a more personal video. Strap in for the disasters. Where do I even start? I have notes. First disaster is the worst. My father-in-law got sick and he lives about 10 hours away. So we packed up everything and went to southwestern Missouri to go help out. And we ended up staying for almost 3 weeks. Southwestern Missouri, this is not St. Louis. This is like the farthest you can be away from Chicago that's not like Oklahoma, Kansas, or Arkansas. We had people check on the house because, you know, when you're gone and you have a small problem, sometimes it can turn into a big problem, like a giant fire or a flood. About 3 days into the trip, I got vertigo, so I couldn't look down for half the time. Otherwise, I would get really nauseous and dizzy, which meant I was completely unhelpful on the trip. Sometimes it felt like I'd be more helpful if I stayed home. Here's a photo of me at the physical therapist with the human vestibular system.
Turns out this thing is pretty important.
I slowly recovered and got better while we were there. And then suddenly my husband got a notification on his phone that there was movement in the backyard. So he opened up the camera app thinking that maybe it would be a delivery person or maybe we got a package or something. But no, there was an actual fire in our backyard. Yeah, our compost bin was on fire. And right next to it was a little wood shelter where we put firewood. So yeah, that started on fire too. So it was just a big old fire that we got to watch live from 10 hours away from our phones, just rage and ignite the tree above it. That was a really special experience. We frantically called the local 911, which had to get to the 911 in our neighborhood. Most of our neighbors were gone for the holiday weekend. On Father's Day, they had other activities planned, so nobody was around to help put out the fire. Somebody did call before we did, so the fire department did get there quickly. But that 7 minutes while we were watching live on our phones, that was a really special experience. Luckily, no one was hurt. The tree is damaged, but it still might survive. Just the fence, the compost bin, and the wood shelter burned, and no other property was damaged, thank goodness. And we're really grateful. Obviously, it could have been a lot worse. There were some problems, though. Halfway through their attempt to douse the fire, the water main broke, and they lost water pressure. They had to leave the bin burning until they could find another source to put out the fire. I didn't really think about that kind of thing happening, but it did. So the water system in my neighborhood is super old, so it burst a water main, causing a river of water to flow down the street. This is starting to look like a bad comedy. I feel like I'm in Christmas Vacation or something.
Worse? How could they get any worse?
All this was happening while we were already in crisis mode 10 hours away. It felt like we were on the other side of the planet. We don't know the source of the fire. We know that compost bins can get hot enough to spontaneously combust, but our bin is kind of small and half of it had already been sort of composted. We didn't have a ton of material in there. The bin is about 3 by 3 by 3 and it's about halfway full of material and half of that material had already been composted down. So it's just really unlikely that it would suddenly start on fire by itself. I have a couple of ideas of what could have happened. You know, we are in fireworks season. Really unlikely that a firework would just land in the bin and ignite some of the dry grass that was on top. Things that are unlikely happen all the time, so that's very possible. It's also possible there were some sparks from the power lines above. There is a tree that someone planted like 25 years ago right under the power lines, and so we have to cut it back every single year because it just grows through the power lines. I had assumed that that's sort of the electric company's responsibility, and I realize now that if they're not taking care of it, then I am responsible for taking care of it myself. Sparks can fly, and they have in the past when the tree was rubbing up against the power lines. So there's that. It is a compost bin. Compost fires have started before. People have had mulch fires before. I do have to admit that it is possible. We're probably never going to know what happened. Had I been home, I probably would have been watering the pile and incorporating that dry grass on top. I think that if we were here, it probably would have been different. I'm just glad that the fire department was there and they helped us out. They're definitely something I would never take for granted again. So now we have a scorched tree, a burnt fence, and some other casualties like this spice bush right here, and a couple of these wahoo shrubs. As far as the moat that we now have permanently in the ditch, I'm not sure exactly what's going to happen with that, but the birds sure do like the new water feature. When the city comes to fix whatever the problem is, they're probably going to have to dig up half of my front yard garden. So there's that. Hey, a fire in the back and a flood in the front are no match for our native plants. Am I right? A lot of our native plants are fire adapted. What does that mean, fire adapted?
California native plants don't give a fuck about fire, bro. This is what your lawn could look like, bro.
It means that they can take a fire every once in a while. Controlled burns of the prairie and forest floor are an important part of conservation in North America. The indigenous people of this area have used fire for thousands of years to manage the land, and we even have species that are dependent on fire to sprout. That's kind of cool if you think about it. So let's talk about the plants I'm not worried about. So this is a wild hydrangea, Hydrangea arborescens. This is the native species. This plant can basically regrow itself every year and come back just fine. It's gonna look sad this season, but it looks like the flowers don't care, and I still have a lot of pollinators. The fire department had to trample it while they were on their way to save my property. Obviously, I'm not mad. The spice bush right here will probably come back just fine. The twigs are still flexible, and I'll bet we'll see new shoots coming out of the branches in a few weeks. This is sumac. I'm definitely not worried about this at all. I'm sure they'll bounce back pretty quick. I shouldn't even have sumac, honestly. It's way too aggressive for my small property. Maybe this is a sign. This small shagbark hickory took some leaf damage, but these leaves are tough. Even though this leaf is brown, it's still pretty fibrous and staying attached for now. Mature hickories can tolerate fire. I'm not so sure about the small ones, so I'm glad that this one's okay. I completely missed the cactus bloom this year, so I'll have to show you a video of last year's flowers. I looked at it longingly through our security camera footage, but by the time we got home, it finished blooming. Normally, we like to discourage birds from building a nest right by our front door because, first of all, it's not a very stable place. We've seen birds lose the whole nest when it just slides off one day. It also means that every time we open the door, it scares the mama bird and she has to fly away and she squawks at us. When we were gone, they totally built a nest and laid eggs in there. So we won't be using the front door for a little bit. These seedlings were already overdue for planting. They really needed to get in the ground in late May when we left, and there was really no way to keep them alive through June, just watering them. They really needed to be planted, so almost all my seedlings died. I know, it's a bummer, but I can make more. Of course, there's lots of weeds in the patio now, so we'll have to spend some time taking care of those. Some of our plants got really big while we were gone, and they grew into the walkway, so I just cut them back, super easy. This Baptisia is way too big for this space, but that's on me. Sometimes you have to make garden mistakes. So my native plants didn't have to be watered, but there's another kind of plant that doesn't need to be watered either, and that's weeds. The specific nightmare here is bindweed. This nasty thing hitched a ride on a New Jersey tea that I got from a very reputable nursery that I'm not gonna name. Everyone makes mistakes, but wow, this was a mistake that really cost me a little bit of work. Bindweed needs to be carefully treated with herbicide, which is really difficult because how it works is the bindweed wraps around all of your other plants so that it can come up to the sun from the ground. So how are you gonna treat it with herbicide without hurting all of your other plants? That's why I had this problem to begin with, is because I kept putting it off because it was just kind of a lot of work to take care of. And then I left for 3 weeks and it got huge. So the way that I'm trying to kill it is I'm just kind of gathering up all the foliage and shoving it into a plastic bag and then putting the herbicide in the bag and then tying it really tight. That way it doesn't affect my other plants as much, and also any critters that are running around in the garden aren't gonna come in contact with that herbicide. It really doesn't respond to pulling. It just kind of spreads and spreads and spreads and looks for new places to come up. If I thought just pulling it would work, I would absolutely get in there. I have no problem doing hard work in the garden, but this is just not one of those kinds of weeds. I wanna get it now instead of using wishful thinking to think that maybe I could control it just by pulling.
The line must be drawn here.
Well, I don't want to leave you with all this negativity. Let's talk about the good things that happened while I was away. When we left, the Chicago area was in the middle of a cicada emergence.
Not great.
And there were cicadas everywhere, and it was super gross. Like, I like insects, don't get me wrong, one at a time, individually, but in groups, not so much. Kind of like people. Their exoskeletons were everywhere. There were just thousands and thousands of them in our yards, and everybody had to cover their trees with this netting that's like usually used to make wedding dresses. Anyway, we covered our trees in this material because the cicadas do cut the ends of the stems and lay their eggs in the stems of small twigs. If you're a large tree, it's no problem. It's just a little bit of a pruning, but for a small tree, you know, you can easily lose half the foliage, and that really sets the tree back. So while I was gone, we were able to avoid half of the big cicada emergence. And when we came back, I was able to remove all the wedding dress material from the trees. Earlier in the summer, I trellised part of our pergola to train our coral honeysuckle to grow up the pergola. I was so happy to see that while I was away, it finally reached the top and it's starting to fill in on the side. So that was exciting. My elderberry cuttings that I neglected last year are now 6 feet tall, and they had huge flowers and there's lots of berries on them. I'm gonna have to figure out what to do because they grew through the pot into the soil. So I'm gonna have to probably cut the pot away from the plant. I don't know how I'm gonna do it, but anyway, they got really huge. They look super big and healthy.
I really want to talk about what a privilege it is to care for our elder family members when they need us. Not everyone is just able to drop everything for 3 weeks, work remotely. I do recognize that as a privilege that we have. I'm super grateful that we were able to show up for our family in the way that we wanted to. People have a lot of difficult choices right now, and they have serious responsibilities that conflict. And my heart goes out to every single family who's making those difficult choices. We're okay. The fire could have been worse. We're grateful for everything that we have. Also, I have a Patreon if you want to help me buy a new fence.